Good evening. NATO has admitted that it did bomb a refugee lorry by mistake yesterday and has broadcast the voice of an unidentified pilot describing what happened in his mission over Kosovo. But it was only a partial account. A second attack was mentioned but not described, and it failed to explain how a long column of refugees on tractors was bombed, killing dozens of people. Brian Hanrahan on NATO's apology and the questions that remain unanswered.
The terrible tragedy on Kosovo's roads has now been caught up in the argument over how it happened and who was responsible. Reporters were shown the debris today, arranged for the camera. The Serbs say more than 70 people died in 2 separate locations. 43 were taken to the local hospital. NATO accepts responsibility for only one of the attacks. It says it cannot account for the other.
The pilot reported at the time that he was attacking a military convoy. The NATO bomb destroyed the lead vehicle, which we now believe to have been a civilian vehicle. I again stress, NATO deeply regrets the loss of life from this tragic accident.
Serbia says that the 2 attacks were on either side of Jakovica, one a little to the west, the other along the main road to Prizren. The Serbian pictures of the attack are clearly in 2 separate locations. One is a made-up road where a convoy of tractors has stopped. One has been blown off the road. Bodies can be seen some distance away. The other location is on a dirt track. Although there are fewer vehicles, it's a scene of carnage with dismembered bodies in amongst both the vehicles and the ruins of nearby buildings. A young boy sobs bitterly. The Serbs say 60 people died here.
And all were partially
NATO's
protected.
briefing today produced a confused account of what happened. They talked of different locations and said the pilot had been sure he was aiming at a military target. They played the tape of the pilot of an F-16 who said he'd located 3 dark green, uniformly shaped vehicles.
I make several passes over these vehicles to ensure that they are in fact military vehicles. I roll in on 2 passes to get a close look, both with my eyeballs and with my targeting pod, and I make a decision at that point that these are the people responsible for burning down the villages that I've seen so far. I roll in, put my system on the lead vehicle, and execute a laser-guided bomb attack on that vehicle, destroying the lead vehicle.
But the pilot's calm account doesn't match that given by the American Secretary of Defense.
Apparently, the pilot went after that convoy, and during the course of that did have some AAA anti-aircraft artillery fire directed at him. Also some shoulder-fired or man-pad type of surface-to-air missiles fired at him.
Today, aircraft continue to patrol over Kosovo looking for targets. For days, NATO has been giving reports of refugees being forced to move around on the roads of Kosovo. NATO leaders say it's President Milosevic who must take the responsibility for exposing the Albanians to danger.
Our pilots and our crews risk their lives every night trying to avoid civilian people being hit or killed. And that stands in the sharpest possible contrast with the way that Milosevic conducts his campaign.
Some of those who were in the convoy have now crossed the border. Their accounts continue to cloud the picture. They say that the attacking planes were low-flying. NATO says they were at 15,000 feet. They also say there were no Serb units near them when they were attacked.
There have been conflicting reports overnight about who was responsible for the bombing of a convoy of refugees, and indeed 2 convoys in Kosovo yesterday afternoon. NATO's still looking at the video footage of the attacks by its planes. Officials have accepted, apparently, that a military convoy in the same area was hit. First of all, the Serbs were blamed. The Pentagon now has pulled back from that. Overnight, our reporter Laura Trevelyan spoke to PJ Crowley, Director of Public Affairs for the National Security Council at the White House.
There's no question that over time the Yugoslav forces have been involved in a very brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Kosovo Albanians. We believe that there has been a systematic effort by the Yugoslav government of disinformation over time. For example, these are the sources of information that have tried to convince us that it's been NATO that has attacked these villages. It's been NATO that has been responsible for the refugee flows. They have said night after night that they have shot down a number of NATO aircraft. All of these reports have proven to be false.
Isn't the risk here that in expanding its range of targets, as NATO has done recently, that the possibility of something like this happen has just increased?
Well, there is no question that there are risks as these operations go on to both NATO forces and to civilians on the ground. NATO takes extraordinary lengths to try to minimize collateral damage, to try to minimize the impact on innocent civilians, but you can never rule out that there are going to be incidents during the course of a conflict that occur.
But isn't the truth that airstrikes aren't really as clinical as NATO would like to pretend they are?
I think that this operation has used the largest percentage of precision guidance munitions that has ever been conducted. We do have the ability, and NATO gun camera footage has shown an amazing ability to strike targets, and I think it's remarkable that there have been so few reports of unintended consequences on the ground during the course of this 3-week campaign.
The purpose of the NATO operation in Yugoslavia was to prevent a humanitarian disaster. What we have seen over the past few weeks has been the most appalling humanitarian disaster. NATO has consistently said the ethnic cleansing would have happened anyway. Milosevic had planned it in advance. But now we're seeing civilian targets routinely hit by the bombers, and yesterday the terrible tragedy of a convoy of refugees attacked apparently by mistake. More than 60 people died, many more were injured. Again, voices are being raised here. The bombing must stop. We asked to interview a government minister this morning, but none was available. However, Donald Anderson, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, is with me, and so is Marko Gasic, the Serb spokesman in London. Donald Anderson, what's your latest understanding of what happened here?
Well, there is still considerable confusion. All we do know is that there was carnage on this road. There were apparently 2 incidents. It is uncertain whether it was a totally civilian convoy or whether there were military vehicles involved in it. All we do know is that it was one of the horrors of war, a personal tragedy. And the Serbs claim, of course, that it was entirely a civilian convoy, but they were going in a direction away from the border, which is confusing. NATO says that there could be the usual deception of military vehicles in between civilian vehicles, but it may well have been a horrific mistake.
Marko Gasic.
What happened was that at 1 o'clock on the road back towards Đakovica, a column of returning refugees returning to their homes, was attacked by 3 projectiles fired by NATO bombers. At 14:20, the attack resumed and ended finally at 15:10. So you had 2 waves of attack by the NATO bombers, and there was a total of 3 policemen escorting basically a convoy of about 100 private cars of innocent, ordinary Albanians, refugees, returning to their homes at the invitation of the Regional Secretary for Health, Dr. Andrić.
So having thrown them out of their homes, they then said you can come back again?
They were coming back to their homes. They were thrown out of their homes by the horrors that we've been seeing since NATO started their campaign of mass murder with KLA support on the ground.
It is his people who have been involved in ethnic cleansing. It is his people who have been raping, who have been forcing these people to flee, and that is the proper perspective on this. They would not have been on that road were it not for the horrors inflicted on them by the Serbs.
It's fascinating how Mr. Anderson knows exactly what happened to them previously but doesn't know exactly what happened to them now. We know what happened to them now. They were squashed like sandwiches, and they're not the first. I should just tell you, John, if I may, that the previous day not 10 people were killed on the Belgrade-Srebrenica Express, but 55 people were burnt to pieces. That's 2 massacres in 2 days.